is it?
Yes, so we'll be taking the questions from the audience, those who will be messaging us. So I'll be reading those out to you.
Right,
After that,
so I'll only be seeing you.
yeah,
Hello?
yeah.
All right.
So we are now live. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's Karwaan Distinguished Lecture. Today we are more than honored to have Professor André Wink joining us from Greece to deliver the lecture titled "The Rise of Islam in the Indus Borderlands." Professor André Wink is a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is known for his studies on India and the Indian Ocean area, particularly over the medieval and early modern age, that is from 700 to 1800 CE. He is the author of Land and Sovereignty in India, that was published in 86, Al-Hind, The Making of the Indo-Islamic World, Volume 1, Early Medieval India and the Expansion of Islam, 7th to 11th centuries, 1990, Al-Hind, The Making of Indo-Islamic World, Volume 2, The Slaves and Kings, The Slaves, Kings, and the Islamic Conquest, 11th to the 13th century, published in 97, and The Making of the Indo-Islamic World, 700 to 1800 CE, as well as numerous academic articles in international journals. Today, we are truly honored to host him to deliver the Karwaan Distinguished Lecture. So, without further ado, I formally welcome Professor Wink and thanking him for accepting our invitation. And I request all the participants who are watching us this evening, they can leave their questions for Professor Wink in the comment section. We'll be taking those post the lecture in the Q&A session. Thank you, sir, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, as you mentioned, it's a great honor to do this lecture today. I'm in Athens, Greece, and I closed all the windows because it's very noisy. But I can hear everything very well, and if you have any problem hearing me, do let me know. So this will be about, as you mentioned, the rise of Islam in the Indus Borderlands. And if you find the subject interesting, I refer you to my most recent book called The Making of the Indo-Islamic World, which appeared in August 2020, just a few months ago, at Cambridge University Press, and I'm sure there's an Indian edition. And you can also find it on Kindle and in paperback and so on. You will be able to read about this subject more. And of course, in my other books as well, I often dealt with this problem. I'll try to be very clear and straight about this problem. It will be largely about conversion to Islam, which is, of course, enormously intractable problem. One of the most intractable problems in Indian history. And as you probably are aware, there are many intractable problems in Indian history and in history in general. Nonetheless, it's also a fascinating problem, and I've always been intrigued by it. What I'm going to say today are some very simple ideas that I hope will contribute to the understanding of this problem. Though I don't mean to suggest that anything I'm going to say is the final word on the subject, quite the contrary. It's, I think, an important idea, or at least important enough to give a lecture about. But it is also clear that there are many other things to be considered, and a lot of research will have to be done. Maybe some of you will later join in the effort and move the field forward. I do think that my contribution is a new one. Otherwise, I would not have brought it up. So let's begin. I say it is an intractable problem because we don't really, it's not very clear often what conversion to Islam really means. It is true that in different religions, conversion means different things. Somebody who would be considered a convert to Protestantism, for example, or Protestant Christianity, it's a different thing, that conversion than, for example, conversion to, say, Buddhism, or the case in point, Islam. Moreover, it is an intractable problem because conversion, however defined, is almost always partial, not complete, if that means anything. And if we are talking about entire population groups, large populations, it is really often a combined process of religious and social transformation that happens very slowly. Now, if something happens very slowly, it is actually usually not picked up in the historical chronicles. As you have probably read historical chronicles of the Mughal period or earlier periods. And these are usually about events, discrete events. They do not often talk about very long-term transformations. So you cannot just consult a couple of chronicles, for example, the Akbarnama or whatever, some famous chronicle, and think that you find a clue to this problem. But this is some of the reasons why it is an intractable problem in history. Yeah, the other thing that makes conversion to Islam in India in particular an intractable problem is the fact that the pre-Islamic heritage of groups that converted often do not tell us very much about why it happened, if you know what I mean. Looking at the pre-Islamic history is not going to give you a clear view about the future and the conversion to Islam in the future. And finally, the one more reason why conversion to Islam is such an intractable problem is that it is the subject of many pious lies, if I may say so. Asking Muslims anywhere in the world about the initial conversion of their themselves and their country or their groups, whatever you want to call them, usually does not give you a right answer. Most Muslims in India try to relate conversion to very early times. The earlier, the more prestigious. Very often, the pious lie is that it goes back to the Arab past. In other words, the early medieval period. As early as possible, for example, there are claims about descent from the companions of the Prophet or the early caliphs, and similar claims of very early conversion that are that can be demonstrated to be historically wrong. They are advanced because it's very prestigious to have an old stories like this. So most of the conversion in South Asia, and this is also true for Indonesia, happened much later than people actually often say it happened. A much later date than most converts allow. So this is not something that gives you a lot of insight in why it happened either. Now, there have been quite a few modern explanations, both in the Muslim world, in India, among Muslims, and also among non-Indian scholars, Europeans and Americans, particularly Europeans, because the Europeans have been thinking about this issue, of course, for a long time. And all these more modern approaches, they cannot be so easily dismissed. Some of them are valuable. My late friend Peter Hardy in England actually wrote a very good article about modern approaches to the problem of conversion to Islam, which was published in the well-known volume by Leftzion called Conversion to Islam, 1979. And it is very useful if you want to have an idea about how other scholars, modern scholars, have thought about the issue. For example, prior to the 19th century, it was very often believed that all Indian Muslims were immigrants. This was, of course, as I said, a belief. It's not true, or far from it, but this was an early belief before the 19th century. That all immigrants were descendants of immigrants, and that there had been no conversion to Islam in India itself. And then all later theories often brought up the issue of forced conversion, which is a very murky problem as well. What does it really mean, forced conversion? Can something as intimate as a religious conviction be forced, one might well wonder. There is also the broader idea that people converted to gain some advantages, say political advantages or fiscal benefits. That is another broad category of explanations, that people did it because they gained material or political advantage. Another famous group of ideas is also that saints, charismatic saints, such as Sufis, for example, have converted a lot of people in India to Islam. And that they managed to convince people of the truth of this religion. So there's also, of course, I don't mean to suggest that people do not convert out of conviction. No, on the contrary. There is such a thing as religious conviction that plays a big role. And certain types of saints are well known to have converted people to Islam. And so that is another long cherished theory. That's certainly correct to some extent. All of these theories, I think, have something to contribute. We do have, actually, we also have, believe it or not, examples of forced conversion, where people are threatened with deadly force if they don't convert. Whether or not the intended result was achieved is another matter, of course, but it happened. There are certain texts which say that, and there are also texts that say that Muslims benefited from it in a fiscal way. So all these things, to some extent, can be found in the literature, but the evidence is actually very fragmentary. But you can find almost any of these ideas, but there's not a lot of evidence about it. So this is all summarized very nicely by Peter Hardy in 1979, like the state of the field, as it were. It's a long time ago, let's say 40 years ago. And since then, we have all been thinking very hard, of course, because it's an extremely important question, needless to say. There are also many misunderstandings that I haven't mentioned yet. The idea that people converted to Islam to escape from the caste system is a very common understanding and usually a misunderstanding, in my opinion, except it happened sometimes in modern days, but this is not what we're going to discuss today. Now, so let's move on. Since Peter Hardy's article of 1979, many scholars have rightly observed that there is a peculiar situation in the demography of mass conversion to Islam in South Asia. And this peculiarity is very simple. The largest numbers of converts are found in the peripheries of the subcontinent, as we call them. Today, Bangladesh and Pakistan. And we might add to that Indian Kashmir. But this is a very often observed fact of the demography of Islamic conversion. And many people have thought about this is really weird, this is a very striking thing. Why is this the case? And today, there is an explanation for this. The most widely held, the most widely invoked theory of mass conversion in South Asia relates it to the sedentarization of mobile populations in these peripheral areas. So people have looked at, well, Pakistan, what I will in a minute call the Indus Borderlands, because after all, Pakistan did not exist in the time that I'm going to be talking about. So people looked at Pakistan and Bangladesh and observed, they thought that they could understand why these parts of the subcontinent are now Muslim. They basically think that it has to do with the sedentarization of mobile groups. For example, pastoral nomads in, say, the Western Punjab or Sindh, and more tribal forest groups in Bangladesh, what is called Bangladesh today, East Bengal. Formerly unsettled groups become sedentary groups, and then they become Muslims. That is the theory. Where do we find this theory? You may wonder if you don't know it already. It's actually a fairly old idea that Islam happens in combination with sedentarization. It has been advanced, for example, by Mount Stuart Elphinstone in his famous, rather unique book, early 19th century book on the Afghans, on Afghanistan. Mount Stuart Elphinstone, and among Indian scholars, Irfan Habib has sometimes resorted to a similar explanation when he wanted to explain Sikhism in the Punjab, the sedentarization. That is an example of it too, of sedentarization and the rise of a new religion coming with it. In its most elaborated form, however, this so-called sedentarization theory is associated with another name, not an Indian, not a European, but an American. Here's the first major contribution of American scholarship. I'm referring to my American colleague and friend, Richard Eaton, who has come up with this explanation and made it into a major theory. He, I would say, is basically, it's important to know that this is American scholarship because it starts with the idea of the frontier that was once advanced by Frederick Jackson Turner to explain what is special about American history. The so-called frontier thesis of Frederick Jackson Turner, which was advanced in Madison, Wisconsin in around 1900, was the most famous thesis about American history of all time. No question, still is. It basically says that what is different about Americans is that they have this frontier, which Europeans didn't have, or not recently. That's why Americans are different. That's the story. I don't mean to discuss the merits of the theory now, because that's another lecture, and I'm not qualified to do so. But Richard Eaton, the original interesting good scholar, who introduced a similar concept of the frontier to Indian history in the context of trying to explain conversion to Islam. And he speaks of the religion of the plow. This is what it means. It's very simple. According to this theory, pre-literate people on the ecological and political frontier of expanding agrarian societies in South Asia became absorbed in Islam when they settled down and extended agriculture. So these are not caste Hindus. These are people on the frontier, according to Eaton, who are on the frontier of Hinduism. Lightly Hinduized, he sometimes calls them. This is a terminology that is, well, it's certainly, you know what it means. It's maybe not a very elegant phrase, but that's what he means. These are people, non-agrarian, non-settled, nomadic, semi-nomadic, and forest people in the Indus Borderlands, my term, and in Bengal that for the first time become settled and then adopt Islam. This is why he calls it the religion of the plow. These are rural people. And he draws attention to this religion of the plow to sort of give some pushback against this idea that Islam is necessarily a city religion. Of course, this is not the case, but many people believe that it is always a city religion. Or even worse, that it is a religion of the sword. That is another, what we might call idea, a very widespread prejudice of Islam, that it is always a militant religion of warriors. Yeah, in the time of Max Weber, for example, people in Germany spoke of the Kriegerreligion, the warrior religion. And some people have also thought that Islam was a desert religion. It's also not true. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And in Germany, where these things were often discussed first, so-called Orientalists, Germany, who wrote a lot, they spoke of the Religion der Wüste, that is to say, the religion of the desert. This is why Eaton is quite right in drawing attention to rural Islam, the Islam of peasants, on the peripheries of the subcontinent mostly. So this theory of Richard Eaton is interesting because it is a break with the old European explanations, which are often, he thinks, Orientalists, quote unquote, though there is fragmentary evidence for all of it, in fact, but never mind. It is a good theory in a sense that it has an eye for bigger and long-term broad processes of social and religious transformation at the same time. And it draws attention to geography, which is very important. In my opinion, that is one of the greatest merits of the theory, that it draws attention to geography, the environment in which people live, which is what Indian historians are now doing more and more, but which should indeed be done more and more. I personally believe that the environment and geography is one of the major things that have been lacking too much in Indian history. So this is very good. Muslims were rural Muslims in East Bengal and also in the western periphery of the subcontinent. My point here is, as I said, it has many merits. It has been around for a long time. It's quite widespread. Many people have heard about it. If not, you definitely must take a look at it. And but in my view, almost all the evidence for this theory comes from East Bengal, not from the western part of the subcontinent. If you look at how it is built up, you can see that there is some fragmentary evidence from the West Punjab, but I believe that Eaton theory is quite correct, mostly, as long as it is applied only, actually, to East Bengal, where an enormous amount of agricultural land was created when the Ganges and other rivers shifted eastwards. This is probably something you've heard about a lot. The river system of East Bengal has been shifting eastwards since about the 12th centuries and earlier already. And now, after that, the delta was created, which is now producing more rice than China. That's Bangladesh. So that society was created when Islam was spreading eastwards as well. So I do believe that the theory of sedentarization and the religion of the plow that is advanced by Eaton in the wake, as we might say, of Frederick Jackson Turner, quite correct for that part of the South Asian subcontinent. And now comes the but. But I would add, it's not correct for the Indus Borderlands. It's just the way it is, in my opinion, at least. The reasons that the vast majority of the inhabitants of the Indus Borderlands converted to Islam have nothing to do with sedentarization as such, in my opinion. And I'll explain why. That is basically what I want to say. Now, first, what are the Indus Borderlands? This is a term that I use a lot. I'm not sure if anybody else uses them. It's not forbidden, but I don't see it anywhere. I use the word Indus Borderlands because, as I said, it would be anachronistic to speak about Pakistan in the 13th or 14th century. It would be ridiculous. And I was looking for a nice, comprehensive term, and this is what I came up with. The Indus Borderlands have 6 parts, in my view. Baluchistan on the west, mostly desert. Then we have Sindh, with Karachi in it. Karachi might one day become independent of Sindh, we don't know, but it is still in Sindh. And then we have the Afghan tribal areas and Kabul, which I consider another part. And then there is Kafiristan, which you may not have heard about. That's what is called Nuristan today in northeast Afghanistan. Then we have the Western Punjab. And to the east and south of the northernmost curve of the Indus, we have Kashmir. That's another part of the Indus Borderlands. Okay, 6 different sub-regions or parts. Now, with the exception of half of the Afghan tribal lands that are now part of Afghanistan, and also with the exception of parts of Kashmir, this is Pakistan today minus Lahore. Lahore is not part of the Indus Borderlands in my view, but all the rest is, except one, today it is really Pakistan, except that Kashmir, with a majority Muslim population, is in India, and half of the Afghan tribal population is in Afghanistan. I beg you to think about a situation in which these borders and the Durand line doesn't exist. More or less like it is what we call Pakistan today minus Lahore, plus a few additions, such as Pakistan and the tribal Afghan lands. Approximately 200 million people today, an enormous population. And growing. People always talk about the overpopulation of Pakistan as other parts of the world as well, India too, but it is very popular, highly densely populated part of South Asia and the world, 200 million people. So what I'm saying is we're talking about a really big problem here. How do we get to a population of 200 million Muslims in South Asia? That's the question that is before us. First thing I again have to ask you to do is to imagine this whole vast area with far fewer people in it. Around 1911, a little over 100 years ago, this area had about 10% of the population that it has today. Perhaps 19 million if you put all the figures together that you get in the British census records. So it is 10% in 1911. And then these borderlands were annexed by the British, that is to say between 1820 and 1850. According to the figures I have collected, which isn't all that hard, this area had about 12 million people, not very many. So not 200 like today, but 12 million. And there's a writer called Charles Masson, interesting figure. As a mysterious person, we don't really know who he was, Charles Masson, who actually recorded his travel experiences in 5 volumes. You can still buy them in India and Pakistan today. I have them myself. I bought them in Pakistan maybe 20 years ago. Charles Masson, the mysterious Masson, I call him. He says, yeah, I am traveling around here in the Kabul Valley, and you know, one thing that strikes me as really remarkable is it's evident that these regions are infinitely less populated than they were in the time of the Babur Nama, which he has read. So he's saying that even in his time, which was around 1810, it was much more populated than in the time of Babur, which is the other great source on these areas. Between Charles Masson and Elphinstone and the Babur Nama, there isn't really anything quite as good. So you go from the early 16th century up to the 19th century. And it's interesting that a 19th century observer who is very familiar with Babur's writings makes this comparison. This is the kind of comparison that you're looking for, but you find very rarely. So he says in Babur's days, these lands, Kabul and Nangarhar and so forth, infinitely less populous than they are at present. So going further back, I have come to the conclusion, which you can, again, if you want, you can read about in my 2020 book, which is just fresh. On the eve of the Mongol conquests, that is to say, in the early 13th century, there were not more than perhaps a few million people in the Indus Borderlands, in what is today Pakistan. This is rather a dramatic conclusion, don't you think? And we have to keep that in mind as historians, that yes, we are talking about the same region that today is called Pakistan and Kashmir, but it doesn't look nearly the same. It is actually very underpopulated, very thinly populated by modern standards. 3 million people in around 1200 AD on the eve of the Mongol conquest. I mention that in particular because the Mongol conquest in my presentation in the next 20 minutes or so play a key role. We'll see. So yeah, talking about what's going on. Yeah, small population in this area, and with few cities. Another thing that not everybody realizes. After all, we have been told in school, in India and abroad, that the Indus Valley civilization that were the oldest planned cities in the world. This is true, but there was nothing left of these cities in medieval times. This is really too bad, but these early planned cities of the Indus Valley civilization, which are prehistoric and indeed very old, the first urban products of the Neolithic Revolution, we might say, they were in the Indus Borderlands, no question, but they were destroyed by around 1500 BC already, and people just forgot about them. I would argue that somebody who lived in the 7th century AD, when the Arabs showed up here, on horseback mostly, they had no idea about those Indus cities, nor did anybody who lived in the Indus Borderlands remember the prehistoric Indus Valley civilization. And indeed, this has not been a densely urbanized area at all. I make that point at great length in the 3rd volume of my book, Al-Hind. Urbanization was precocious in the Indus area, but it was not stable. partly because the rivers were not stable. These river shifts of the Indus were quite destructive often. All the cities of the Indus Borderlands have been destroyed in one way or another by earthquakes or floods and so forth, the river shifts, whatever. So when the British arrived in the 19th century in the Indus Borderlands, they find mostly Hindu-dominated bazaar towns, which are quite small, not big cities that had large Muslim populations, and where Islam was developed. No. It is indeed a rural Islam in this area, and cities do not play a big role here. It's not that urbanization drove the process of Islamization. This is important to mention because most people who study the Middle East, they continue to think about Islam as a city religion. So this is not the case at all. So few people and even fewer cities. It is very true that Islam is mostly rural in the Indus Borderlands, like East Bengal. In this sense, Ethan is totally right. This is a similar type of rural Islam. But in the Indus Borderlands, this is the problem. Sedentarization of people precedes Islamization by millennia. People were sedentarized along the Indus for millennia. This is the oldest settled population in India. So you cannot say that Islam is the product of sedentarization because it was already sedentarized long before any Islam existed or any Muslims arrived. So sedentarization preceded Islamization in the Indus Borderlands by millennia. And secondly, they were not lightly Hinduized in the medieval period at all. There was, in fact, a great deal of Hinduism in the Indus Borderlands. These countries had been developing for centuries within the framework of medieval Hinduism of a kind that was not very different from the medieval Hinduism that was developed in what we may call the Indian heartlands, north central Hindustan perhaps. Except that Kafiristan, that was not Hinduized. No, that was really the end of the world, we might say, from the point of view of settled civilization and of Hinduism. The Kafirs in this very obscure area of Kafiristan, they had no written language. They could not often even remember where their gods came from. They were certainly not Indian. They were not Greek either. Though there are people who think that they were actually leftover of Alexander the Great's army, or that they were Greeks transported there by the Achaemenid emperors. All of this may be true or not, I don't know, but they had no memory of it, and they don't speak Greek. Some Greeks want to believe this, that they are really Greeks. And even I was told that the Greek ambassador in Islamabad donated some money to the Kailash in Pakistan, thinking that they were Greeks. The Kailash must have been pleased with the donation, perhaps, but we cannot prove that they were Greeks because they don't speak a word of Greek, and on their languages are not Greek at all. And they have no written language. They are immune, apparently, to the traditions of the Indo-Iranian environment, the Hellenistic environment. It's very strange. They had, as you can see in the film by the Kipling, of the Kipling book, The Man Who Would Be King, these wooden statues that were idols, you might say, icons of gods. In the film, the two British intruders actually shoot their guns at them. It's a ridiculous scene. So you can see these statues in the Kabul Museum where they're lying on the floor. This is not Hinduized. This is not, yeah, you might say this is very lightly affected by written traditions. All the rest, however, had Hinduism. Quite significant manifestations of it. For example, the Kabul Valley and the stone temples of the Salt Range in the Punjab. These are very important architectural evidence of Hindu Shiva worship, in fact, in medieval times. In the Valley of Kashmir, you are probably aware, I was told there was recently a lecture on Kashmir. And now is the time to show my temple, if you don't mind. Kashmir was actually a core area of medieval Hinduism. As you can see on this picture, one of the most famous temples of Kashmir. This is in fact a Hindu temple, but it shows elements of Hellenistic temple building as well on the right. An 8th century temple, which is one of my favorite buildings in India. It's extremely interesting. The Martan temple, and this is a picture of 1868. It's built in the 8th century by the Karkota dynasty. And it is an example of sedentary Hinduism producing a monument, a monumental temple, an early Hindu temple, in other words, that looks like it is there to stay. Here we have a sedentary agricultural valley civilization, which is one of the core lands of medieval Hinduism. And yet, in due course, Kashmir converted to Islam. So here we have a problem for the so-called sedentarization theory. We can now go, drop the picture, please. So my point is that all these areas of the Indus Valley borderlands, especially Kashmir, but also Sindh, were very much sedentarized long before the rise of Islam. And they had medieval Hinduism. Some of them are extremely important in the development, but Kashmir in particular, the development of medieval Hinduism. This is also true in Sindh, where we also have Persian and Zoroastrian influence, etc. You read the 7th century traveler Yuan-Tsang, pardon my Chinese. You can see there are many Hindu temples there, although not of stone, and there are also Buddhists. So all these areas are really part of Indian civilization, although there are also elements of course, of Iranian civilization. And we cannot say that they were lightly Hinduized. I entirely disagree with this verdict. This is not a tribal culture of nomadic, of nomads or mobile populations. It has been long sedentarized. There were, of course, also nomadic people there, important groups of nomads who never sedentarized. You can look at the Baluchis, for example, who came into Baluchistan from Iran, and they were already Muslims, but they never sedentarized. So you don't need to sedentarize to be a Muslim, or even a good Muslim, however defined. And there were many groups that, including Jats, the Jat nomadic population are still in the early 20th century. They're not sedentarized, and yet they are Muslims, quite a lot. So that also is a problem. There are many mobile groups that never sedentarize, yet they are very convicted, very committed, I would say, Muslims. Perhaps unorthodox ones, yes, that could be the case, but they're very committed. It is certainly not the case that nomads cannot be committed Muslims, even though they may not have writing. Ibn Khaldun, the 13th century North African historian, still a very important author, also says that they are often the most committed Muslims. The Bedouin and even the Turks who are not settled, you don't have to be a peasant to be a Muslim, not at all. You can be pretty much anything. That is what we are looking at here. So that is, in terms of debunking, all I want to say. Now for a more positive idea. This is my final statement. The second, penultimate statement. I'll try to wrap it up then. My idea that I want you to consider here is that the historical and religious transformation of the Indus Borderlands is very similar to what happened in the Persian Plateau and in Anatolia, but not similar to what happened in East Bengal. In all these three cases, in the case of Anatolia, Persian Plateau, and the Indus Borderlands, we can see the same development, but which is that existing religious culture and society unraveled under the impact of nomadic conquest and migration over several centuries. Widespread destruction, in other words, precedes conversion to Islam. So here the idea that I want to introduce is that for mass conversion to Islam to occur, the old, centuries old existing religious traditions have to be somehow destroyed or unraveled by nomadic conquerors who move around with entire societies, not just an army of 20 or 1,000. No, we're talking here about entire nomadic societies roaming around in these areas over centuries and destroying the existing, in the case of the Indus Borderlands, Hinduistic culture. This is what I would like to add to the debate. So it is what I mean is this: people who have read the historical chronicles of India and the Muslim world, they will have read very often about the Mongols, because the Muslims have always said that the Mongol invasions were the worst disaster that ever happened to Islam. That is what these chronicles say. For example, Juzjani, Tabakati Nasiri, he says that all the time, that the Mongol conquests were a disaster of unprecedented magnitude in the entire Muslim world. It's probably true, except that indirectly, they have actually paved the way for the spread of Islam. That's at least my view. I would like you to consider this, that actually the conversion to Islam of large parts of the Middle East, from Anatolia to the Indus Borderlands, only happened after the Mongols had destroyed older existing, what we might call pagan societies from the point of view of Muslims, that were there for centuries, but unraveled under the impact of century-long nomadic migration and destruction. So let's take a very quick look at this. It's the same idea that I want to advance in the three areas, that the old has to go before the new can begin. In medieval Anatolia, you can look at the work of Spiros Brionis. He's a Greek who wrote a book called The Decline of Medieval Hellenism in Asia Minor and the Process of Islamization from the 11th to the 15th century. This is a book called, published in 1971, which more or less says the same thing as I'm arguing here for the Indus Borderlands. Briefly summarized, he says that the impact of the nomadic pastoral society of the Turkomans, or the Turks, nomadic people, their impact on the highly developed sedentary Byzantine society was disastrous. Repeated shocks and dislocations undermined the foundations of Byzantine society in Anatolia. This took about 4 centuries. Shock after shock. This was a genuine nomadic conquest over many centuries, occurring after the, well, very important Battle of Manzikert in 1071, until about the conquest of Constantinople in the 15th century. So this is very important. This Turkish nomadic conquest over many centuries is very destructive and therefore very different from the early campaigns, military conquest of the Arabs. The Arabs had been attacking the Byzantine areas already in the 7th century, but that was really like military encounters. These were not nomadic invasions on a grand scale. So there were like a couple of decisive battles and then a military occupation without widespread destruction. That is what Spiros Brionis has to say. And I tend to think this is a very compelling idea. The early Arab conquests were not destructive on a big scale. They were just military campaigns and then resulting in a quick occupation. But the Turkish conquest from the 11th to the 15th century were nomadic, entire societies moving into Anatolia and Asia Minor. And these destroyed the foundations of Byzantine culture. And then gradually we see the spread and conversion to Islam after that, or in combination with that to some extent. The same happened in the Persian plateau. I'll be short on that. Many historians of the 13th and 14th century have pointed out that the conquest of the Mongols in Persia were extremely destructive. Entire cities were wiped out. This may be exaggerated, but not so much. There may be lots of fugitives rather than people killed. The places like Herat and Balkh and so on, they were almost wiped off the map, or people fled in large numbers. So in Iran, there was also an influx of large numbers of nomads with their horses and sheep, like entire societies moving in. And it really changed the balance of nomads and peasants. So a very similar story. The existing population probably, but that's something that is somewhat speculative, probably did not convert to Islam until this major transformation was occurring. In other words, after the Mongol conquest. So in the eastern part of the Persian plateau, which is to say in the Indus Borderlands as I define them, it broadly follows the same development. Again, not at all like East Bengal, but very similar to Persia and the Anatolian and Asia Minor area. In the Indus Borderlands, the Arab conquest had also been quite fast, a question of some decisive battles, and then a military occupation under Muhammad ibn al-Qasim and others. No extensive damage, in other words. There is no evidence of extensive conversion in Arab Sindh. Some people have tried to argue that. Some people have even tried to argue that Buddhists converted to Islam. There's absolutely, in my opinion, nothing to be said for that idea. I certainly don't think it's valid at all. We have the Hudud al-Alam, which says in the late 10th century that there are no Muslims in Sindh, except in the Arab capital of Mansoura, there are Muslims. But for the rest, there are no Muslims in Sindh. So I'm inclined to think that there was almost no conversion to Islam for the first 3 centuries of Arab rule. Arab rule in Sindh did not result in conversion, in my view, to Islam of the local population at all. The same I have said in many places, that the same happened under the Ghaznavids and even the Ghurids. These were violent conquests to some extent, no question. Often spearheaded by Mamluk official Mamluks, yes, but they were not nomadic invasions on a great scale. No, actually, they are remarkably small armies. These Mamluk armies of the Ghaznavids are actually quite small. And I'm not suggesting that they were not military confrontations of very serious nature. They were, but they did not result in widespread destruction. However, the Mongols in the 13th century did. So when the Mongol nomads started pouring into the Indus Borderlands, as they did in the early 13th century and afterwards, they came to an area that had been under Muslim rule for about half a millennium already, but where no conversion had yet occurred. This is something you have to wrap your mind around. 500 years of Muslim rule in the Indus Borderlands, most of them, I'm not talking about Kashmir here. Kashmir was not part of the Delhi Sultanate. Some people forget about that, but this is the case. So Sindh and the rest of Punjab had been under Muslim rule for 5 centuries already. But my point here is there had not been conversion of local populations on any significant scale to Islam. But like in Anatolia, like in Iran, when the Mongol nomadic occupation begins and enormous numbers of Mongol nomads pour into these areas, between about 1221 and 1398, that's for a long time, these were very destructive, and only after that do we see a gradual process of general conversion of Indus Borderlands societies begin, including Kashmir, which has been famous for its fertile valley and where agriculture is very old and preceded, of course, the rise of Islam. But Kashmir too was comprehensively wrecked by Mongol conquerors. There's a famous quote, which I also have in my book. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, this comes from the Rajat Rangini, the later editions. Jonah Raja wrote, quote, Kashmir became almost like a region before the creation, a vast field with few men, without food and full of grass, after the last Mongol invasion, which I believe occurred in 1323. There were probably 4 Mongol conquests of Kashmir. I have listed them. It started under the Kashmir king Ramadeva in the early 13th century. Another one came in the middle of the 13th century, and Marco Polo mentions the third under a nephew of Chagatai in 1772. And then the Rajat Rangini mentions a fourth, which is the most destructive of all, in 1323. So an old settled civilization of medieval Hinduism comprehensively destroyed by Mongol nomads in the 13th and 14th centuries. And I make this point for all of the Indus Borderlands. The only part of the Indus Borderlands that the Mongols do not overrun is Kafiristan. And you know why? It's because you cannot enter that area with horses. Kafiristan is one of the most forbidding mountain areas. It produces wine. I was told it's pretty okay. And it has been known as a wine producing region, where Babur always gets his wine there, Kafiristan, as he says, in boatloads. But you cannot enter Kafiristan on horseback, and there's never been a horse culture there. And so the Mongols, Timur tried to enter it, but it didn't succeed in the 14th century. So there were no Mongols overrunning Kafiristan, and lo and behold, did not convert to Islam until the late 19th century, when the so-called Iron Emir imposed it on that region. So Kafiristan was not conquered by Mongol nomadic armies, or what we normally call nomadic hordes, essentially big moving groups, ordo, camps. I have tried to document this destruction as much as I could in detail, and I think there's quite a bit of detail if you put it all together. The agricultural corelands of Sindh, for example, were hit very badly from the beginning, and many, many times. The southern Punjab and Sindh, the agricultural areas there are completely destroyed by many different occasions. The Multan region, already from 2024 onwards, almost all these Mongol campaigns and migrations went through the Multan region, or through a northern route, which is the route from Ghazna to Lahore, which was also very important. Many different raids and migrations. And what is important to understand about the Mongol presence in the Indus Borderlands as well is that they later were the Chagatais, descendants of Genghis Khan, but the most unsedentarized of the Mongols in the later 13th century. These were the Chagatais of Central Asia, not the Ilkhanids or the Yuan in China. No, the Chagatais were the closest to a purely nomadic society of all Mongol uluses, which is to say Mongol political units. The Chagatais were the most destructive, therefore, because they were the most unsettled. And there were also freebooting, even marginal Mongol groups, the so-called Nugadaris, who are led by a nephew of Chagatai. Those were even worse. They often singled out for cruelty and devastating impact. Sort of like Tatars, as you can see, for example, in the films of Eisenstein. I like these films of Eisenstein a lot because the Russians know about nomads more than other people mostly. And they make films about them that are often pretty good. Like the Americans make films about cowboys and Indians. The Russians, in particular Eisenstein, if you look at the film, Ivan the Terrible, you see how that works, this Mongol or Tatar destruction of entire regions. This was no fun for the recipients. So in Israel, you can see those films because there are many Russian immigrants in Israel. It's always on television, these films, like cowboys and westerns in the United States, which are still quite popular. So you can get a picture, if you want, about these Nugadari freebooters and how they operated in, well, quite civilized Indus Borderlands and destroyed everything that they could reach. Very warlike and undisciplined subsections of even the Mongols, among the worst Mongol groups that we have. These inherited the Indus Borderlands from Genghis Khan. So the biggest invasions were in the early first decade of the 14th centuries. Particularly, they reached all the way to Delhi sometimes, though not for long. On the Tamashirin, for example, enormously large groups. And large parts of these Indus borderlands were just flooded with Mongol nomads, with everything they could bring along, and armies, families, horses and sheep, whatever. Same was true, as I said, in Kashmir. But this goes on until the late 14th century. We still have a bit of it in the 15th century. For example, the Argoons, which are a rival group of the Timurids later. And we have Hazaras, which are famous in Afghanistan today, but they also were very much part of the 15th century Indus borderlands. And they were unsettled, nomadic, Mongol-derived groups who were still moving around in the 15th century. But now the last point that I want to make is that the rise of Islam in the Indus borderlands took place in an era of great anxiety and destruction that began with this turmoil that followed the Mongol invasions and that accompanied the Mongol invasions and destruction in the 13th and 14th centuries. And that ends with a complete reordering of the political structure and recovery of these areas within the expanding Indo-Islamic societies, particularly the Delhi Sultanate, but also in Kashmir, which is not part of Delhi Sultanate, after it comes to an end, after this Mongol presence largely comes to an end, partly because of the effective defense of the Delhi Sultanate, but also because many Mongols withdrew. How many withdrew and how many did not is impossible to make out. But for a long time, we have a state of great instability and tribal flux in this area where Baluchis and Mongols and Turks and Afghans are moving over great distances still. And it is in that context that Islam appears to have spread. So it has nothing to do with sedentarization as such. Islam came to these regions through what we call pirs, the saints, the institutionalized cult of the pirs and saints, sometimes called holy men, and also shrines built over their tombs, And these so-called peers and saints and shrines, they have multiple roles, including the rebuilding of communities that have been shattered. Community building in the context of some kind of gradual conversion to Islam. That's, I think, how it happened. The fundamental reason for these saints and these shrines was, of course, religious, yes. They made Islam accessible to non-literate people, mostly non-literate peasants and also pastoral nomadic people, whatever. These saints were able to mediate between God and man, as we say. They were a kind of spiritual power, and they could intercede on behalf of the emerging devotees. And so this is one way that it happened. It is a way of communicating a form of Islam to non-literate people, rural people mostly. These Muslim saints were actually usually married. They had children, and the spiritual power was also hereditary. So inherited saintliness became very common. And acquisition of great wealth by these shrines was also quite normal. And so these became very important elements of an emerging religious political structure in the Indus Borderlands almost everywhere. Some of these so-called saints had actually an almost royal power, and they had small armies, like maybe 1,000. That is something that we may not necessarily associate with saints in the West, but this was the case in the Indus Borderlands. But these saints and these shrines became wealthy and important fixtures in the emerging religious Islamic landscape. They also were known for their miraculous and healing powers, not only for their knowledge of Islam. And the shrines became very important community centers in many ways, also a sort of psychiatric institution. We should not forget that, especially in areas that had suffered major damage. It leads to psychiatric conditions on a wide scale. These Mongol conquests, just like the First World War did in Europe, for example, or in many parts of the world. And so medieval mental health industry was also associated with these shrines. Many of the shrines also, actually, it's interesting, they were created on the spot of former pagan centers. They, in a way, perpetuated earlier pagan cults very often, so-called Muslim shrines or ziyarats in the Indus Borderlands. If you dig into the soil there, you often find Hindu, what the Muslims call idols, what we should call icons more neutrally, in the same area, or in sort of places of natural distinction, like where there are springs and wells and so on. So in some respects, we have a sort of what we might call somewhat polytheistically inclined Islam emerging here around the cult of Muslim saints. These saints, some have said, replaced the gods of Hindus. It's not entirely true, but there's something to be said for that. It's the cult of saints is, of course, in conflict with certain versions of Islam, but this was the type of Islam we find in the Indus Borderlands. Hindu festivals are replaced by Muslim festivals. The so-called saints, which are very numerous here, are also community builders, as I said. They are bringing stability in an unstable society by defining rights and entitlements, by political arbitration, for example, by showing demarcation points between pastoral tribes and agricultural areas, which is very important, in particular in Sindh, where the Persian wheel is introduced at the same time, and there's further expansion of agriculture. So they were very important in agricultural activities. That doesn't mean that they're associated with sedentarization necessarily, although sedentarization may have occurred as well. It's what we might call a total demographic restructuring. And in this, these Muslim saints play a major role by formalizing rights rites of passage along routes, grazing rights and so forth. Also by introducing festivals where normally hostile tribes can meet without hostility. These places are places of haram where there's no fighting allowed, for example. And places of haram where trade between hostile tribes can occur. Places of conflict, revolution, and others, also between Shia and Sunni. So in this way, I try to argue in these various ways, Muslim saints and their shrines become core elements in an entirely reconfigured religious landscape throughout the Indus Borderlands, which had been comprehensively destroyed in previous centuries by nomadic Mongol invasions and attendant tribal movements. And these religious figures become instrumental in the gradual conversion of the inhabitants to Islam. And this is why we are fortunate to find in the chronicles of the Delhi Sultanate in the 14th century, the first serious indications that there are many Muslims in, for example, Sindh. These Persian chronicles speak about large Muslim populations in the 14th century, but not earlier. So the earliest evidence of large-scale conversion in these areas is usually 14th and 15th centuries. That doesn't mean that everybody converted, no, not at all. History is not like that, of course. Even today, we have millions of Hindus in Pakistan. Not in very good shape, that's not the case, but there are millions left. And of course, even in the 17th century, for example, in Eastern Afghanistan, we still find lots of Zoroastrians. It's not something that everybody knows, that the conversion to Islam was not complete at all, even by the 17th century. At least a third of the population of the Indus Borderlands never converted to Islam. Nonetheless, there was an enormous amount of conversion and cults of saints in these areas at that time, which marginalized almost everything else that we normally associate with urban and literate traditions of Islam. More than in most parts of the world. But not uniquely so. We have a similar situation in Morocco, for example. If you refer back to an old book by Ernest Gellner, The Saints of the Atlas, you can see the same thing. The multiple social roles played by saints, illiterate populations, and marginalization of the urban literate traditions of Islam. But this is the type of Islam that we find, and some people have said that there are 125,000 saints in Sindh alone. They're wildly exaggerated, it's just mythology, but there were many. And the early British visitors, they always pointed out that this is a cult of saints in these areas. And not until the 19th century do we find a more scripturalist type of Islam brought in here, but from the outside. The first evidence of that is 1826. Bareilly, Sayyid Ahmed Shah Bareilly organized a kind of jihad against the Sikhs with a very different type of Islamic, let's say, credentials, more Wahhabite. He wanted to get away from this worship of saints that is considered un-Islamic by the Wahhabites. And today, as you undoubtedly know, the Taliban have attacked these shrines, often, fortunately, very bloody attacks, because they don't accept the cult of saints either. So the Taliban represent a later variant of Islamic tradition that has nothing to do, I think, with what we find here in the 14th and 15th centuries, and indeed into the 18th centuries, this cult of saints, in which the saints are very much important elements of a community and a society that is a work in progress after widespread destruction over 2 centuries by Mongol nomadic invaders. That's all. That's the idea I wanted you to consider. And I have nothing further to add at this point.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Wink, for such an engaging and interesting lecture that you have presented just now. We have so many questions from the audience for you, and we'll try to take as many as possible. And the first question is from Rick Sam, and his question is: do you agree with Samuel Huntington's thesis of clash of civilization?
She said, I'm looking at a text. Can you do it again so I can read it as well?
Yeah, so I'll send it to you on the Zoom chat.
I don't.
Yeah, can you see it now?
Do you agree with Samuel Huntington? Oh, is that the question?
Yes, this is from Rick Sam.
Well, the way I understand Samuel Huntington is that he predicted a class of civilizations after the end of the Cold War, that people would clash over civilizational differences more than in the past. He does not say that these civilizations always clash or in the past were bound to clash. This thesis has become quite controversial, and I don't refer to it in my explanation of conversion. It is certainly not possible to say that we have a clash of civilizations in the 18th century Indian borderlands. No. Which is not to say that it may not clash, that some civilizations may not clash elsewhere at other times. I suppose it's possible and that it has happened. But not in in medieval India. There was actually many overlapping elements, which people usually like a lot better than clashes. Although there are also many Muslims, such as represented by the Taliban, who resent these overlaps very much. If we stick to the subject at hand, because the study of Islam in modern times is an interesting subject, but it's slightly different from the one I wanted to discuss today. I am certainly not saying that the world is heading for a clash of civilizations that's going to be widespread, and that Islam and the West or whatever, I don't think people still talk about the West. I personally think it's become a useless term, if it ever was useful at all. Yeah, I mean, what does the West really mean? The Roman Empire wasn't even the West. That was as much Asia and Africa as it was Europe. So and the Byzantine Empire was entirely, well, half of it was in Asia. Yeah, I really don't know what the term West is supposed to convey, but a clash of civilizations between Christianity and Islam is certainly not always happening, and it's not something that has to happen, though there are, of course, clashes. It is not necessarily on a collision course. I don't mean to make predictions about it, or certainly hope not, but in the time that we are talking, no. I don't see a clash. There are certain theologians like Ibn Taymiyyah that are against compromise with strictly non-Muslim traditions. Yeah, that is what we might call a non-compromising attitude. Whether or not that results in armed clashes is another matter. Usually there was some kind of accommodation between various groups, perhaps for the better, yeah. Nonetheless, there were also invasions in India that were violent. Yeah, I don't think we should try to deny that. There was also Hindu invasions that were violent. I mean, why not? Even Buddhist ones. The history of Buddhism is full of clashes as well. So I'm not saying that Islam is heading for a clash of civilization with other civilizations, no. But I'd rather get off the hook with this. I mean, let's return to the Indian history and the earlier history, if there is any other questions.
Yeah. The next question is from Prantosh Bandhopadhyay and sending the question. It is, in South Asia, who took initiative for women education and women emancipation, such important directive of Islam? Why and how ignored?
What is the important directive? The women in Islam? Is that the question? Yeah. This is a subject that can be answered to some extent with the 19th century, but in the earlier centuries, we do read about women who are, generally speaking, of the upper classes. That is to say, there are queens and kings and princesses that get a fair amount of attention in the Mughal period and earlier, like Razia and other major rulers in medieval India. Their education is often mentioned as well. Even the Tughlaq rulers, they often enslaved Hindu subjects and then made them, or they were converted to Islam. And it often mentioned that many women that were actually captured by the Tughlaq armies were taught how to read the Quran and became literate. And sometimes were even sent to Mecca. So there's a lot of literacy among women, but this is what we learn about courts. In the rural areas, I think it's very important for us to understand that for us modern people, which is what we all are actually, we travel around in 13th century Sindh. You may not encounter a library for many weeks. There are not a lot of books around. There might be manuscripts here and there, but people had never seen a book usually. And education was rare for men, and it was therefore also rare for women, though it was certainly not unusual in some cities later on, in Delhi, for example. The role of women is extremely important, but their literacy is only mentioned very often in the context of the courts. I have mentioned in my latest book that Mughal India in particular was a society in which the culture of chivalry prevailed. And chivalry has one element all over the world, which is that it invests honor to an extreme degree in women. Honor is associated with women. So in that context, you hear a lot about women. Not necessarily only Islamic, also in the case of Rajputs and other Hindu ruling groups, chivalry is considered a really important thing. Honor, in other words. And this is the case much longer than it is the case in Europe, where you have the transition to infantry armies and non-chivalry. Don Quixote is the last chivalry, really, and he's declared insane. By himself, even. In the end of the book, he says, I'm insane. But he was the last really chivalrous person. But chivalry is very important in medieval Europe before it is replaced by modernity and economics and so forth. Honor was more important than calculation, bookkeeping. This is one reason why, for example, the Mughals are extremely precise when it comes to matters of honor, but not so precise with the fiscal numbers. If you read the Akbarnama, it's often very carelessly thrown together, these numbers. You cannot make much sense of it. But when it comes about points of honor, those are extremely precisely monitored. And so this is a chivalrous society in which women, the honor of a whole society is often very much invested in women. Among the Rajputs, this is famous. This is not necessarily a good deal for women, if you wanted to call it a deal, but it was extremely important among both Muslims and Hindus in India until at least the early 19th century. Whereas in Europe, it had already been replaced by, let's say, Protestantism and homo economicus and bookkeeping and infantry armies and gunpowder weapons. In India, people continue to have a chivalrous society based on horsemanship. That's because many of these groups had a nomadic origin. In that sense, women are often highlighted. But their education, it's usually reserved for princesses and rulers, Nur Jahan and so forth. Those people, yes, the upper class, extreme upper class.
Yeah. The next question is from Sukhdev Sohal, and his question is: was it Islam that attracted people in northwestern India, or graded religious inequality within Hinduism that pushed the lower classes towards Islam as a spiritual escape?
Yeah, that's a good question. And indeed, many scholars used to argue that Islam was embraced by many people who could not stand the caste system, who didn't like it, who wanted to get out of it, and the only way out was become a Muslim. Now, the point is that, yes, we see that sometimes in modern India. I've read, when I lived in India, well, for example, in the early 80s, that was sometimes in the newspapers that in Tamil Nadu, such and such lower caste Hindu groups had converted to Islam because they didn't want to be lower caste Hindus. So yes, this is apparently possible, and I'm sure it's still happening, but we do not use this as an explanation for the conversion of the Indus Borderlands because there's no evidence for it. The evidence that we have is that Hinduism was largely destroyed by these nomadic Mongol invasions. And in the turmoil of tribal migration, there was not much left of Hindu caste system. Though it did exist before, in Kashmir and in Sindh, there's quite a lot of evidence that there was such a thing as a caste system. Even Brahmins were very dominant there. But that lower castes managed to become Muslim and wanted to be Muslim in medieval times to escape caste is not based on any evidence. There is no evidence for that. Though it seems a thought that will never go away. In Pakistan, you often hear that. It's not true. But certainly, it also is my current thinking. Maybe somebody else will discover something that brings it back into the equation. I don't know. So far, it is thin pickings. Okay, next.
The next question is again by Sukhdev Sohal, and his question is: Islam had 3 geographical pushes into the northwestern India, like Arabic, Persian, and Mongolic.
Yeah.
Which of these variants turned potential in taking roots in the region, and is there an Indic Islam?
Well, in a way, yes and no. I would say that in India, in many parts of India where we have Islam, customary laws are more important than Islamic law. But these customary laws are not necessarily the same everywhere. Between, let's say, Kashmir and Indonesia, customary law used to be the law. Islamic law was actually quite rare, again, because it is scriptural and many people didn't have access to it. And even if there was access to it, customary law was more important, adat law. And Dutch scholars in Indonesia have often also pointed this out, that it is the adat law that was really what mattered to people, except in the religious context when it comes to, for example, blasphemy or alcohol or marriage. I think in the religious context, Islamic law was often important, but in the wider, broader societal framework, customary law. And the Mughal dynasty also operated largely by customary law. At least this is my conviction. So these communities are very strong. They are Indic and they may have customary law. They may know about Islamic law, but what mattered was some kind of customary law, which had certainly Indic components. For example, Indian culture was also part of customary law. So yes, there is a certain amount of Indic law and Indic custom, in these societies. And kingship is often based on Indic models and so on. And cosmologies have been found that are Indian in origin, but they're also supported by Muslim rulers in Indonesia or in Malaysia, or in Mughal India, for example. Akbar is very famous for that, but not only Akbar. So it is very complicated, but my main point would be that scriptural Islamic orientations of the modern kind are quite rare in earlier times. It's a very different type of society. With the centrality of these saintly figures in particular, and the widespread lack of literacy in all pre-modern societies. We have to understand that these are completely different societies, and therefore their religious life is also very different, even though we call it Islamic. It is Islamic in many ways, but also Indic, yes. Okay.
Another question is from Sammy Kosov, and her question is, do we find any evidence of Muslims coming anywhere in India, what is now from the Afghanistan region in the north or in the south around the time of immediate companions of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him?
Yeah, good question. The conquest of Al-Hind, as it is called in the Arabic text, was and the Hadith was considered the most difficult conquest that was going to happen. It was considered the most dangerous and most difficult, and it was postponed several times because it was considered too difficult. Don't forget, the Arabs were not many. There was a shortage of manpower in the Arab times. So they were pushing into the subcontinent, first in Baluchistan or the Karwaan coast, in fact, already pretty early. I think it's 1641 or so that we have the first Arab war band, ostensibly Muslim, penetrating into these Indus Borderlands. So pretty much at the beginning, yeah. And then there were a couple of naval raids soon following after that. I have somewhere listed all this stuff. That was 30 years ago. I'm not entirely sure the dates anymore, but very early there were incursions, we might say, into the desert areas of the Karwaan coast, which is described as a totally inhospitable terrain where nobody would be happy. And so they were very hesitant. The early Arab Muslims were hesitant to enter India because they felt there was going to be formidable opposition there. And they had to cross major deserts that even for Arabs were very daunting. They didn't think they had enough people, whatever. So only in 711-12, Muhammad al-Qasim assembles a major army, do we get a really big military push into the Indus area. So not at the time of Muhammad, but very soon thereafter.
Yeah. So we will take 2 or 3 last questions for the evening, and this question is from Sagnik Sarkar, and his question is, how do you conceptualize the religious zeal of the Ghaznavids? Was it largely political to gain legitimacy of rule by posturing as Orthodox Sunni Islamists, or there was more religious fervor at play?
Well, from what I understand, it was they were committed Muslims in many ways. Yeah, it's not like they were just a war band who wanted to embellish their military ferocious violence by appealing to some religion. That also happened. Sometimes Afghan robbers in the Khyber Pass would declare these robbing expeditions a jihad. Now, of course, this is easy to say. You can call anything a jihad, but the Ghaznavid rulers were genuine Muslims, no question, I think. Not that they would be reading, but they were certainly familiar with this Islam and a textualist tradition of Islam. Both the Ghaznavids and the Ghurids, the Mamluks also, they were, I think, committed Muslims, yeah. Like Babur, no question about him. Babur is very precise. He says, we are really good Muslims, but we violate Islam. Unfortunately, we shouldn't, but we do. And then we encounter these people who are half Muslims, who still have pagan, he calls them half Muslim. He's very precise what a Muslim is. It's not like negotiable, not for him. Okay.
The next question is from Amar Bazl Khan, and his question is: if Islam in the Indus Borderlands was due to successive Mongol invasion, what is the best explanation for the demographic distribution of Islam in the southern Deccan or Bengal? Does the sedentary theory remain the most viable explanation in those regions?
There are many reasons why we also find fairly large numbers in the Deccan and well, Bengal is the story that, as I said in the book of Eaton, is analyzed. I don't want to go back into that, but because that's essentially a new society creating in the Muslim period. But in the Deccan and in South India, we also have Islam and very important areas. For example, the Malabar coast, it has to do with the conversion of coastal populations, which is a different story that I did not mention. I'm not going to discuss because it will take too much time. And then in the inland areas of the Deccan, well, there are all kinds of reasons for the people converting. For example, intermarriage or uprooted captive populations that were basically moved by force from one area to another during military operations of the Delhi Sultanate. It's quite possible. They would capture maybe 80,000 people, which are technically slaves, although that doesn't really mean very much. And these would potentially become Muslims somewhere else. I think enslavement has often led to a conversion. And then there's the activity of saints, like conversion by Sufis or fakirs or whatever you want to call them. And then there's also a spontaneous conversion that people who just wanted to become Muslims and had no other reason than that they were convinced of the truth of that religion. But don't forget that if you go back 6 centuries, these groups were actually quite small. And then in the course of centuries, it may become millions of people. But the original convert population may have been 10,000. A bit like when you invest money in Amazon.com in 2010, it might be 10 million 10 years later. I mean, what begins small can actually multiply in the course of centuries. And so it's not like millions of people, 100 million people converted in the Deccan. No, but all these other reasons play a role. But in the Indus Borderlands, one factor was that the previous society was very much destroyed. That's at least what I was trying to say today. Another one.
Yeah, so the next question is from Nasudhur Rahman Fahim, and his question is: it was clearly evident that there are 2 types of spreading of Islam, one from the ruling purpose and another from the saints. Do you think or find any evidence in Bengal that any collision happened there, or rather Sufis played a vital role?
They did, and particularly in rural development in East Bengal, which is now Bangladesh, the ulama and Sufi saints played a vital role. When that territory was brought under Islamic rule at the same time, so all these things gained momentum at the same time, then agriculture was also expanding. And this is one reason why we now have a Muslim society there, which is quite large. So I would say it is a question of various inputs, various factors, including military authority or political authority in Bengal, but on a more humble level, agricultural expansion, often initiated by the ulama or Muslim saints and all kinds of other people working in combination with the political elites. So all these things I think are very important.
If you allow, we'll take the last question for the evening now. And this is from Arjun Abhishek Roy. His question is, if you can see it on the screen, conversion is supposedly a very common phenomena in religious history, especially in Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. If you contest the idea of conversion, then how did Islam arrive in the subcontinent?
I only contest the idea that caste Hindus in the Indus or the Indian heartlands easily converted to Islam. That was very rare. Wherever there was a existing caste structure that was old and solidly in place, it was very difficult. It very rarely happened that there was conversion. Only when those structures were destroyed, could that happen. So there's a great deal of resistance against conversion among Hindus in Hindu society if it is very much structured around caste, which is very often the case. So Islam arrived in the subcontinent by immigration, by conversion, also by commercial relations and all kinds of other ways. I do not contest that there was conversion. I only say that conversion was very difficult in Hindu societies that were very hierarchical and that were not badly damaged by whatever. And this damage, this element of damage is what mattered in the Indus Borderlands. There were caste systems there in Kashmir, for example, just as similar to elsewhere, but these were badly damaged. Therefore, Islam, the spread of Islam was easier there. They're not automatic at all. In history, nothing is automatic or very clear cut. But I think the main element that people have so far left out of the study of Islam in India is that you do not go from Hindu to Muslim. There's in between there the Mongols who destroy previous society in some parts, only some parts, not everywhere. So it's a very complicated question. And conversion happens for different reasons elsewhere. But in the Indus Borderlands, there's this one extra factor that made it likely that it would happen, made it possible, though it takes many centuries again. I would suppose that even in the 17th century, there's still a lot of unconverted people living there.
Thank you so much, Professor Wink, for answering all the questions that we had from the audience in such great details and for delivering today's Karwaan distinguished lecture, which was an interesting and a very enriching lecture on the rise of Islam in the Indus Borderland. This lecture will be available on our YouTube channel for those who have missed this live conversation, and they can watch it on our YouTube channel anytime. Thank you so much, sir, for...
Don't forget to push the thumbs up button.
yeah. So don't forget to subscribe, click on the subscribe button.
Yeah, as I said, this is not the last word, but I hope that it gives you some idea, an additional idea about this very important problem, one of the most important ones in Indian history, that ultimately led to the partition, and there are many other things to be said about it. But also, thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, sir. And I hope
tea time here.
Yeah, we sincerely hope that this lecture will pave a way for future researches for students in India and abroad on this topic, and maybe many more researches and theories, maybe framed in later researches.
Yeah, and you can read about it in my recent book if you want.
Yeah.
Perhaps more clear if you read about it.
Yes.
So more convincing.
Yeah, the book is available on Amazon, and we'll be posting the link of the book in our YouTube description, so you can go and click on that link and get the book. That's available on Amazon. Yeah.
Yes, you can. And I hope that it will be available in India also. Unfortunately, I haven't been to India since the pandemic began, and I really regret that. I wish you fortitude with the situation.
Yeah.
I will not be able to come for a few more months, but hopefully afterwards, I will restart my research as soon as I can. I hope to be there soon, and in Delhi too. I was in Delhi for many months, since 1959.
We would love to have you in India.
Well, I hope we meet live someday, and let me know whatever I can do when I'm there, because I always enjoy meeting people when I'm there. And the other Karwaan lectures, I will look forward to see it on YouTube. And thank you again for the invitation in these difficult times.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. And thank you so much, everybody who joined us live on Facebook. And thank you for showing such love and support to Karwaan. I hope you will have a great evening ahead.